Hey everyone, and welcome to the hero's journey. So this game may seem a little complex at first, but give it a go and I think you'll find it far simpler than you thought. The basics of it is that your deck is largely divided into two halves, a heroic side and a villainous side, which you'll shuffle together and... Wait, I've gotten my notes mixed up. Oh, this is about the hero's journey, the supernatural episode. Sorry, this card game I'm developing with a friend has the working title of The Hero's Journey in it. Don't worry, CW, I'm not going to sue or anything. Though I would not say no to a tie-in expansion based upon the show. As for the episode in question, the whole thing starts with a random guy. Let's say this is him. He's in a cage match and he's fighting a random girl. Let's pretend this is her. They sit in there and fighting each other while discordant music plays. Yeah, if you think this joke is going on way too long, imagine how it was actually at the beginning of the episode. When they finally finish with all that, we get a little day in the life where Dean goes off shopping for groceries and finds his credit card declined and baby with a parking ticket. Meanwhile, Sam is trying to cook and is making a mess in the kitchen. Not in the manner you'd expect while cooking. Yes, it seems that these two are having a very bad, no good, horrible day. But they get a call from their old buddy Garth and drive off to go see him up until the car stops. So the guys have to get out of the car and walk the rest of the way to Garth's house. Sure, you'll be Garth. Once there, Garth gets Dean into a dentist chair and starts fixing his cavities, while Sam just has a bad time with Bess's homemade cure. Well, they find out that Garth's cousin-in-law was involved in this underground fighting ring and decided to go destroy it for some reason. Of course, since this is one of the worst days ever, the boys eventually become captured and Garth comes in to blow the place up, destroying many monsters and saving the Winchesters from a much larger, scarier foe that would have beaten them otherwise. The boys sit in the Impala, see that Garth's going to have a happy home life with his beautiful bride, and then drive off again to see about solving their problem until the car dies. There's this trope called conservation of details, basically summed up as don't waste your audience time. If it's not needed for the story, then just cut it out. Mostly this is a practical writing tool. After all, on a conceptual level, Sam and Dean might take a whole week to hunt down a monster. You'd have 2 to 3 days of them driving across the country, then a day or two researching and hunting the monster, and then same amount of time driving back. None of us have time to watch that in real time. We have our own stuff to do during the week. So the show gives us a 3-second clip of the Impala driving down a highway, and then we cut to a new location. A lot of techniques for crafting and telling stories is built around this fact. Skip the boring stuff, show us what matters. But this rule does have a corollary. I think I'm pronouncing that right. The longer a story goes on, the more interesting and entertaining the mundane will become. How many monster hunts have we seen the boys on in 15 years now? But Dean in a dentist chair? That's pretty new. That's kind of exciting. So on a gut level, I love this episode because it was in the grand tradition of Supernatural's wacky and weird episodes, and it did it by being completely normal. If this episode had been about Garth and Bessie needing a date night, and then Sam and Dean have to babysit 3 werewolf children on top of their bad day, I would have ranked this 5 shells easy. But this episode went wrong. Why? Well, the major problem in the episode is built upon a smaller problem. You want to focus on only the details that matter in a story. You do this a little too much, though, and stories can start getting a little weird. The ever-popular question of, when do characters go to the bathroom? When do they eat? I sometimes call this the mundane problem. Sometimes you can get away with, oh, when they're off screen, that's when the characters are taking care of that. The small problem in this episode is that Supernatural never had that mundane issue in its stories. Kripke, in a kind of brilliant move, knew how to often use those moments to fill out necessary scenes, to give the series a real grounding. For example, in the very first episode, we see the boys filling up the car's gas tank. Even if you don't remember, your brain did, because it had one of the most infamous lines of the show. All together now, driver picks the music. During that mundane scene of the boys filling up the gas tank, what was the story purpose of it? You built upon the world a bit more, establishing the music selection of the show, and established very key facets to both Sam and Dean. Mystery Spot in Season 3 was a mundane episode before this one, as we saw numerous ordinary actions that we didn't normally see, and they all got Dean killed. Heck, this episode wasn't even the first time we saw Dean get food poisoning. That would be Season 4's wishful thinking. If you think about it, most of these moments that'll come to your mind will probably be from the original 5 seasons. The most notable exception would be Baby from Season 11. Now, the question is why? And, well, because as the show drifted away from its original vision, these moments became less, because the show was becoming more like an assembly line. If any mundane scene was in an episode, it was usually so a monster could interrupt it. The larger problem, then, is brought forward when Garth outright says the hero never sweats the small stuff. Because when he says that, we've now moved this idea of conservation of details from the subtext of the show out into the open, in the overt text. And when you do that, it highlights what's gone wrong. Once upon a time, the boys did sweat the small stuff. It's only lately that they've become less like real characters and more like comic book superheroes. The show was originally great because the boys were supposed to be normal guys. Once upon a time, they did prepare heavily before going into a potentially dangerous situation. As I'm fond of saying, writing is like magic. And when you bring the subtext out in the open like this, it's like the magician calling your attention to what he's doing. Hey everyone, notice how I'm wearing long sleeves? Yeah, now I do. And you just soured me on what was a delightful experience. Because now that I'm thinking about it, I'm less engrossed in your performance. I am now too separated from the show to get as invested as I once was. Heck, then you start thinking about other problems. Like, if Chuck was previously protecting the boys from everyday hassles because they were the protagonists, why weren't they having these problems when he couldn't see them? And then you have this whole bit with Alaska at the end. It gives me the impression that the show is looking for a problem to fit its solution. Or the writers are just fighting each other over what the season should be doing. The fake commercial was about the only thing I liked with the whole fighting ring part of the plot. The boys are in an episode with Garth, who had an entire episode a few seasons back, again teaching Dean not all monsters are bad and need to be killed. So why bother with this warehouse? They just assume people are being hurt, but there's no sign of it other than the monsters that are hurt. And they volunteer for it. Yeah, I enjoyed how badass Garth was, and that's a treat, but how many cousins who just needed some money did he kill with that explosion? Speaking of, the latest Supernatural book has Garth playing a major role in it. Given this episode, the canon of this may be a little bit hard to fit in, but if you can kind of hand wave it without too much trouble, I think you probably really like it. I'll give a full review eventually, but if you really enjoyed Garth's segments in this episode, I think you would probably enjoy this book. Almost everything I just said wouldn't be quite enough to push this out of 5 shells. maybe down to 4.5. What ultimately killed this episode is the time wasted. I know what I said at the beginning, but the simple fact is that the opening fight at the start of the show and Dean's tap dancing sequence, both of those went on for way too long without being entertaining enough on their own. And normally I'm a sucker for action sequence, but the cage match was just dull. And the novelty of Dean's drug trip wore off by the time Garth visited him in it. Why couldn't we devoted more time to Sam's view of this experience? Or Garth's home life? Or maybe giving actual reasons to blow up the fighting ring? You could have still had those sequences, but trimming out half a minute or a full minute from either of them would have much improved the experience. So for those who don't know, the hero's journey is a real term. It describes an archetype pattern of stories and general plot structure to them. Its most famous example being this little indie film you might have heard of called Star Wars. The bare basics of it are of a naive character starting from a place of comfort, then going out into the unknown, facing trials and tribulations before ultimately accomplishing a grand goal and then returning home. The original 5 seasons of Supernatural are a hero's journey that I could probably do some stuffy, pretentious video on. For this episode, though, I have to wonder who was on a journey. Garth had more of the archetype in his personal story than either of the Winchesters. The problem with that, though, is the title of the episode refers to plural heroes, and Garth is by himself. When it comes to the boys, the story seemed like it really wanted to do a reverse of the archetype, of heroes taking a journey back down to normalcy. I guess that's the problem, is that this episode just didn't commit. The writing failed when it brought to the forefront how far the show and characters had drifted from their original vision. But then it never commented on that. It never judged or developed that drift. It had a great chance to bring everything back to the roots, to remind us of a time when the Winchesters were just ordinary guys, but ultimately it didn't. That's why I have to give this episode a score of 4 out of 5. I wanted to give it 5 shells. I really enjoyed the first half and am thrilled Garth got a send-off. Now we just need one for a certain redhead, maybe? I'm just disappointed that this episode couldn't reach even half of the potential the setup offered. Still, for the season, this is now, I think, the best one. Until the next episode, try not to park in front of any fire hydrants. And don't forget to floss.